Okay, wow, I am so impressed to see so many people. This is the topic of the day, and I'm really pleased to see so many people come out. Welcome to all of you. I'm Laura Tuck. If you don't know me, I'm the Vice President for Sustainable Development here at the bank. And we, the World Bank Group, are absolutely delighted to be supporting the Global Commission on Adaptation. As most of you know, it's being co-led by, well, I'll say our very own for the moment, Kristalina Georgieva and Bill Gates, co-chairing with Ban Ki-moon, the 8th Secretary General of the UN. So today, we are going to talk about the Commission's very first report, and I hope you all saw the news in The Guardian, in the BBC, etc. Fantastic press. The report is called Adapt Now, a Global Call for Leadership on Climate Resilience, and you're going to hear all about it. It's very well done. And what's important for us, particularly at the bank, and I think everybody here, is our mission. As you know, our #1 mission is to fight poverty, and we cannot do that if we don't adapt. You all know the science has told us it's happening to us now. It's going to get worse. We have to accept the inevitable, and we have to address it. I have been working in development for 40 years, and what really is heartrending is when you see these development gains we have worked so hard for, agricultural yields, getting infrastructure out there, and you start to see it damaged and degraded and falling apart, and we have to find ways to do development differently. And you look outside, you see it happening every day. Just look at what happened in the Caribbean with Dorian. I hope all of you will keep the people of the Bahamas on your mind and think about that. But not just them. Impacts of natural events are everywhere, and we have to invest in a low-carbon future. We have to reduce the impacts it's going to have, but we have to adapt to the inevitable and make resilience adaptation a priority. That's what the report is all about, and I am so glad that this is picking up, because so much of the work that's been going on in climate has been on mitigation, and you're going to hear a lot of questions answered today. So some of the questions is how? What do we actually do? What are the opportunities out there? What is the cost benefit of this? What is the World Bank doing on this agenda? What more can we do? And I'm sure you have lots of other questions. So we're going to start by asking our acting CEO, Axel von Trotzenberg, to give us some opening comments, and then you've all seen the agenda. We will go through with Andrew Steele from WRI and the rest of the panel. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Let me also first welcome the Minister from Grenada, Minister Steele, who is joining us this afternoon. Welcome to the bank, and appreciate that you took the time to join us. It is also clear that I'm standing in for Kristalina. She's one of the biggest champions on climate change, but as you know, she has taken leave during the nomination period for the IMF Managing Director. So I'm the acting one on this, and so I will try to match her passion. And I think really this report is interesting in many ways. We have been seeing a lot of reports on climate change, a lot of reports on the diagnostic. And we actually feel it every day. If we are now looking at our summers to becoming hotter, I'm also the Vice President for Latin America. If you are looking what is happening in the Caribbean with now an increasing intensity, but also increasing frequency of hurricanes that have devastating effects. And last week was unfortunately yet another reminder how devastating that can be. And if you look at the case of the Bahamas, how it has affected. But also, having worked on East Asia and the Pacific, you see, unfortunately, these cyclones also in the Pacific having an incredible intensity. I think what this report is not going to talk about only what the diagnostic is. But I think what is the delta of this report is that here a commission got together and to say, okay, what do we need to do? And not only to give here a sense of urgency, but also a sense of doability, that we can actually act if we are actually focusing on a lot of areas. And what it is trying to do is there is a lot of homework to be done. Be it in the water sector, be it in the infrastructure, be it in the agriculture sector, be it in urban areas, be it in the policy area, be it in also the preparedness and getting better prepared on this. And what the report is really trying to do is how translate this that you say, well, I've heard that before, but it also provides a very concrete way forward that you say, okay, when you invest, you get a dividend. They go to the triple dividend. That you actually, if you do preparedness, you can avoid devastating losses. If you do invest, you have a higher return, and the economic return is best captured to say, look, we challenge the international community to put $1.8 billion into critical needed investments, and you get for every dollar, you have the prospect of getting $4 in return. So 1 to 4. That is where is the economic dividend. And then finally the environmental and social dividend. And we have been doing studies on this that we have said, look, unfortunately, what is happening with climate change, it affects the poorest. And we have made estimates that if we actually continue as is, we are going to see at least 100 million people poorer than currently is the case. And that is only due to climate change. And I think what therefore the report is trying to say is, okay, this is what is the reality. We want now a coalition. And in a way, when it is a global call, it's not a global call just calling here in Washington, but it's a global call to the private sector. It's a global call to governments. It's a global call to the civil society, and it is a global call to the multilateral community. And that is why it lands then now to Washington and to us here at the bank. What are we going to do? And here we have some good news, is that thanks to actually a lot of work by across the bank group, we have been able over the last couple of years, been very successful to mobilize more IDA and to have 2 capital increase, one for the IFC and one for the IBRD. Now, you said that is great news, but what actually is, there is a policy package behind this, and behind that policy package, we have been saying that at least through 2030, the World Bank Group would prepare projects that are going to yield at least $335 billion in climate co-benefits. So that is the call for action, and we need to translate this. What we need to translate is what maybe this document is showing, is that we need also to change the composition from mitigation to more to adaptation. As we speak, we are basically delivering in the order of 30 to 40% of our co-benefit into for adaptation, and that has to be lifted. So that is one of the challenges, but it's also the challenge how we actually then translate what we are doing. Currently, we have over the last 3 years, we have produced adaptation co-benefits in the order of about $51 billion. So that's about, that is a good start for the World Bank Group, but we'll have to do more. And what we have to do more is now to see how we can raise this. And I think that is going to be the challenge that we have, not only from the people who are in this room, but really to see, okay, how do we seize this opportunity? This document is what we will do ourselves, but including how we then better partner with others. That can be with the private sector, that can be with governments, and how do we translate that into our programs? Secondly, we need to look at coverage. How do we cover? It cannot be to say, well, okay, we'll let the SD folks take care of it. It is a collective responsibility, be it in the sustainable development global practice. It can be also, of course, in infrastructure, but it should be also in HD and FA. So we have to see how we join forces across the bank to make this happen. The other part is clearly how we then actually design these programs and actually implement this fast. I think that is also a thing that at the end of the day, results count. And how do we actually translate that quicker, and how we do that together? I think that the challenges are enormous. So the way we need to think about is not only what we do and then celebrate our single project. We have to see how we can actually do this jointly together. And I think that actually for this one, this document is, I think, to be congratulated to. It was done fairly fast, but we have also here, I think, in the next year, another conference, I think in the Netherlands, where basically we should actually be able to report how we are lifting. I don't think this report is not interested in yet another study. It is basically, are you doing something, and what is the World Bank contributing this? So our challenge, I think, of this document is not taking note, but it is really, as it said, is a call for leadership on climate resilience. It is a sense of urgency and even that we need to do something. I think we are well positioned with the endowment we have, with the staff we have, and all what we have to do is now to move aggressively, but also in the spirit of a global coalition, working with our beneficiary countries, but also with the partners across the bank group, across the world, and to make it happen. And hopefully then next year, when there is the next meeting on this issue in the Netherlands, that we have something announceable, positive, and that we're moving forward. So thank you very much, and let's make it happen. Thank you.
Well done, Axel. Fantastic. Thank you, Laura, very much. What a pleasure it is to be here. I'm Andrew Steele, President of the World Resources Institute, and it's been a great joy for us to work with the World Bank so intensively on this very important report. There are a couple of people that should be giving this presentation rather than me. One is Manish Bapna. Where are you, Manish? He's our Executive Vice President who oversaw the whole report. And the other is Christina Chen, who's our Director of Resilience and Adaptation and co-director of the entire Commission. And many of your old friends like Carter Brandon and others, I think, are here that were very involved in writing the report. The World Bank has been involved in virtually every aspect of this. Thank you, John Room. Thank you to the water team, the urban team, the agricultural team. Thank you, Jürgen, for very exciting things. So too, many of the ambassadors or embassy people are here, and executive directors also have been very involved. Look, we will adapt to climate change. That's not the question. The question whether we'll do it now, smartly, wisely, in a way that we prosper, or whether we wait and have huge economic and human misery as a result. Will we delay and pay, or will we plan and prosper? That's the real question. And a year ago, we set up this commission. Why? Because whilst there are some brilliant points of light around the world, some fantastic things going on adaptation, it wasn't adding up. There wasn't a political narrative, there wasn't metrics that were well understood, and quite frankly, we were losing the battle. And whilst mitigation was rising up the agenda, adaptation absolutely wasn't, and the clock is ticking, and by the end of 2020, we need to have NDCs that really take adaptation seriously. So that was the motivation. I think you know who the three co-chairs are. Some of them you know better than others. Today, by the way, this is not the only meeting. Very early this morning, we had launches in the Marshall Islands and Fiji. We've been to Beijing, Delhi, and all those other places. So Washington is the second to last. And one of the things we tried to do is make sure that, for example, here in Fiji, it's not just in conference rooms. This is where the issue actually takes place. So too in the Marshall Islands, this happened today. In China, there's a couple of your friends there. I think you all know Patrick. That's Minister Li Ganji from China, one of the leading players in this whole enterprise. There's Nick Stern and Naoko and some of the commissioners from India. and so on. Amazing, 20 countries at the head of government level said, yes, please, we want to sponsor that. This exercise. This is quite encouraging. They're taking this pretty seriously, and if you look who's on the list, it's a pretty impressive list. From China to Grenada. Simon Steele is here as a brilliant minister from Grenada, and it's fantastic to see the conversations going between these great countries. I'm sure you can read that quickly. These are the commissioners. Take the trouble to read it in the book, because amazing group of people, ranging from the head of Slum Dwellers International to the president of the Marshall Islands. So we're now halfway through. Most commissions produce a report and they say, well done, and they have a launch, and then they've spent all their money. The good news here is that the best resources have been saved for phase 2, and on the 23rd, along with the World Bank and many other countries represented here, we will be launching the year of action that will accelerate what has been said. Now, as you can imagine, we try to distill, using the best data, just how costly climate change is in temperatures, in seas, in storms, in shifting rainfall, acidification of the ocean. Individually, these are deadly. When you multiply them together, this becomes really toxic in terms of the economy, in terms of society. And so we talk about a moral imperative, an ecological imperative, a human imperative, and an economic imperative. And you've seen all these data many times before. Indeed, the World Bank is absolutely at the frontiers, not only of analyzing the issues of adaptation and resilience, but actually practicing it on the ground. Axel mentioned the economics of this. Most policymakers tend to think of adaptation as something, my goodness me, we're going to have to invest a lot of money, we're going to have to pour a lot of concrete, and all we're going to be doing is stopping bad things happening that we don't even know if they're going to happen. So we did a huge amount of work together with some of you on 5 sectors in particular. And we said, suppose you were to put 1.8 trillion into these 5 sectors, what sort of rates of return would you get? And for that, and by the way, we'll have to spend more than 1.8 trillion in the next decade, but we picked an indicative bundle of investments, and we'd get 7.1 trillion in return. And you notice some of them, I mean, the early warning systems, almost 10-to-1 rates of return. But even the water resources, mangroves, you're still up at the sort of for every $1 you put in, you get $5 back. I mean, it's stunning. So if you want a good place to put your money, don't put it in the stock market, put it into adaptation. Very few finance ministers think about this today. And so it's not just stopping bad things, actually. As Axel said, there's something dynamic going on here. So, for example, if you manage to make your economy more resilient, there will be more confidence, and we can now document the fact that investment will grow. You wouldn't have the City of London now in the east part of London had you not had the Thames Barrier, by the way. So really remarkable, something that economists haven't thought about, which is make the economy more resilient, and investment and innovation will rise. And it turns out that invention really, necessity really is the mother of invention. As Axel said, there's a third dividend, if you like, that many of the most important things you've got to do for adaptation, including, for example, landscape restoration, where you bring carbon down from the sky and you make soils deeper and more resilient, that also leads to better yields. It also leads to improvements in mitigation too. So there are these incredible co-benefits. So if it's so fantastic, why is it not happening? And it is happening some places, but nowhere near enough. So we say that what you really need is a mindset change as well as a technical change. 3 revolutions in understanding, planning, and finance. They need to be applied to a whole range of economic systems, and then done that, we then move into the year of action. So just on these revolutions, pretty obvious at one level, we have amazing science now, but that science is actually not getting through to decision makers in user-friendly ways. Whether you're a head of state, or whether you're a CEO of a corporation, whether you're a mayor, or whether you're a village leader. We need an international effort to make climate risks visible. Second, planning and decision making. For 100 years since we've had modern planning, we have assumed that past trends are a good predictor of the future. Well, they aren't anymore. We've got to move from straight lines and smooth curves to jagged edges, and we've got to focus on uncertainty and economic productivity. This requires a mindset change and some pretty sophisticated tools as well. Third, finance and investment. Everybody knows that the financial sector claims it's good at assessing risks. It's good at some risks, although some would say it's not even good at those, but it's good at some risks. It's done a pretty lousy job, obviously, on climate risk, but they're rising the curve quite quickly. The problem is it's very siloed. It's not being spread throughout the financial sector. We need a pretty aggressive effort to change that. So we lay out a whole set of policies, many of which you've seen before, all of which I think you would warmly welcome. So the question is, these changes that require mindset and technical change will take a decade. But we need to jumpstart things in the coming years. So let me just, we have action tracks, as we call them, in 8 areas. The World Bank is involved in most of those, by the way. Let me pick just 4. And under each of these, we have initiatives. We have identified champions and coalitions. We're identifying financing, not for us, by the way, but for those who want to be champions. Let me just mention 4 very briefly. Finance and investment. It's all about making climate risk more visible. So what about fiscal policy? The World Bank oversees this amazing coalition of finance ministers for climate. How about in the next year using that group to really nail down what climate smart, resilient fiscal policy looks like? So that's one of them. So too, the economics of adaptation. We had a fantastic meeting with your chief economist, with Steele, who's coming up. Wouldn't it be great if the economics profession could become as good at resilience and decision-making under uncertainty as it's become on mitigation? So too, second, water. What is it all about? Getting serious about future availability of water. Most countries in the world do not know what their future water availability will look like, and yet there are tools that can enable them to do it. How great if we made an offer to every country in Africa, for example, that wants to come forward and really wants to take water seriously. The World Bank's water practice is very central in this process, together with a second initiative on urban water resilience. Third, food security and rural livelihoods. We're privileged to have Bill Gates as one of the co-chairs. As you can imagine, he's very, very driven by this. The focus is on 500 million small farms in the world. And the humble aspiration in the first year is to double CGIAR funding. The rates of return for CGIAR are huge. Jürgen is, I think you're still chair of it, so you should love us because we're really working to achieve that. So too, there's an initiative on digital access, so too on insurance for poor farmers. All of these need a level of political and financial muscle that needs to be ramped up. The World Bank needs to be a very central player in this. And just finally, locally led action. The vast majority of money for adaptation goes to government, goes to middle level. But very, very little actually goes to the people that are the best equipped to make the decision. Grenada is a wonderful exception to that. There's a fantastic fund that you've created. And a number of institutions, including, for example, the Asian Development Bank and others, have said, we are willing to try and stand things on their head, put money where decision makers are closest to the ground. So those are just some examples of what we're planning to do, and you obviously here are also very engaged in the calendar for the coming years. We move into the super year of 2020 when the stakes are so amazingly high. We're going to give every ounce of our energy to make this work, and I know you are too. Just one final slide. Sometimes people say, oh, it's so complicated, you know, it's not working, we'll never be able to do it. I mean, and all over the world now we're seeing examples of truly stunning achievement. The hurricane or the typhoon that killed 300,000 people today would kill, it's still very sad, a tiny fraction of that. When I lived in Vietnam, first month as country director of the World Bank, we had a typhoon and 5,000 people were killed. That same identical typhoon today would kill about 10 people. Still very sad, but amazing achievements can be done across the whole thing. Thank you very much indeed.
What is normal now? Is it 4 months of back-to-back rains? Or is normal half the amount of rainfall? I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out.
Hindi me tuan nan makawag kanaro na bay jaka nga sinakais po na kay na lagi niya rin kay saksi ngay ibon nang na iron feel sad.
Alors la mer a pris une partie de la maison.
الاجتماعية وكل شيء من بعد قلنا علاش ما نحسنوش الدخل ديال هذا البحر هذا.
Fish farming, it is a sustainable use of land and it can stand floods and drought.
যখন মাছ জগৎ থেকে আস্তে আস্তে মাছ কম হয়ে যাচ্ছে তখন পরস্পর
kura mena ka biru dala na kaka seto position moro ma ka pi biro godo to pikongo cho mondo mi pigik bamya na dia seto site moro kama na ya kunipi
Aron tiran na yung kani ibu kira mera usu sa tayo ake to ara kaya kunan nangari kaya.
Y mi trabajo consiste en el conocimiento de las reforestaciones, esa oportunidad tan grande de trabajar.
maupun manfaat ini adalah untuk menangkap sedimentasi agar sedimentasi tertangkap di belakangnya dan akan terendap sehingga tumpukan itu menjadi sedimen yang kuat sehingga banyak mangrove yang tumbuh di belakangnya.
Civil defense ru manku 4 दिन रो ट्रेनिंग दै छथि से ट्रेनिंग रे हमको विभिन्न उद्धार कार्य विषय रे सिखा जाय छी.
Vamos a fazer tudo para mesmo para segurar para que a água não venha estragar de novo. A minha vida já trouxe mudança agora.
El efecto del cambio climático ha podido aminorarse con estos trabajos que se están realizando en la comunidad y desde luego los beneficios también son globales para el país y para el mundo.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Axel. Thank you, Andrew, for an absolute tour de force. Powerful, inspiring, enlightening scene setting for the next half hour. We've got to change the way we look at this. That's very, very obvious. And we want to now double down, if I may invite the panel members to come up on the stage. We want to double down on what you've put in front of us. We got to change our DNA. We got to change the way we think about planning, about execution, about financing. I think you made the case very powerfully. So here we stand in the Preston Auditorium of the World Bank, and you're calling for not only one revolution, but 3 revolutions, if I recall correctly. So that's a pretty historic moment. Please take your seats, and we'll pick these points one by one. Let me first introduce the panel, or maybe first introduce myself. My name is Jürgen Vögele. I'm the climate director of the World Bank since July 1, and I'm looking forward to engaging with all of you in making this happen in this institution and beyond. Let me introduce the panel members, starting with Laura Tuck, who's already spoken. She's the Vice President of the Sustainable Development Practice Group here at the World Bank. Sela Baglio, who is the Vice President for Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions, also called EFI, if you hear that, Effie. She told me just earlier she may want to change the title because it's a bit too long, but we'll get to that later. We have Minister Steele from Grenada, who is the Minister for Climate Resilience, Environment, and a number of other things, also a very long title. I think it includes fisheries, but coastal protection and other things. And we have Christina Jan, who has been very involved co-leading the production of this report. Let me start off maybe with Laura to sort of double down a little bit what we've heard in the last 15 minutes. So what does this mean for countries that we work with on a day-to-day basis? What does it mean? What's the next step? How do we take this forward after the report is out and after the hype is over? How do we actually get this done in practice?
Thanks, Jürgen. Let me just welcome everybody again. Let me just say a couple things before I answer that directly. The main message, and I think it sounds really trite, but I'm going to keep saying it, is good adaptation is good development is good adaptation. There is no more you can think about having development without adapting to what we're seeing now and what we expect to see. It just doesn't make any sense. And you heard from Andrew and you saw some of the numbers. We can keep doing the numbers because as the science changes, it becomes all the more imperative and more profitable to do these kind of investments. But we've put out some reports. For instance, we put out a report called Lifelines recently that looked at infrastructure, and it showed that a lot of times it doesn't even cost more to do it right if you think about it and you plan, and we can come back to that. But on some of the economics, we did the numbers in lower and middle income countries, the direct impact in just two sectors, in power and transportation of natural disasters, on average every year is about $18 billion. So you saw some net numbers up there, $18 billion a year. Okay, that's a number. But what's interesting is it's not just the direct effects. When you start to look on the impacts of companies not having electricity and not being able to manufacture, people not being able to get to hospitals, or kids not being able to get to school, or families not having water to cook with, et cetera. And you look at these knock-on effects, the number goes up to $390 billion a year. So you start to see very quickly how even the smallest investments are going to pay off, and you're going to see some of the numbers like the way Andrew put up there. Think about it. In a city like Kampala, you get even a moderate flood and a third of the population can't get to the hospital. I mean, we have to think about this as we plan and we design everything we do. Now, I'm just going to mention a couple of things. We're working in every sector, but if you think about, for instance, in West Africa, we're working with 6 countries on the West Africa coastal areas project. And what does it do? It's doing coastal protection. You know, I had the opportunity to travel in this area, and you literally see before your eyes how quickly the coasts are eroding. So what can you do? You can fix the dunes, you can do beach restoration, you can restore mangroves and wetlands, you can build dikes and seawalls, and really help prevent this creeping adjustment in the shoreline. Most of you know about Hurricane Idai, Cyclone Idai in Mozambique, and what happened in Beira. And there we're working with the city to do a whole rehabilitation of the stormwater drainage system, to put in place water retention basins and to put in flood control points. And in the areas where we had already done our work, we saw minimum, sometimes no damage from the storm compared to places where we hadn't been working. So you could actually see these benefits. And then you shift to another sector, like in West Africa, agricultural productivity project, where we've given some 160 varieties of climate-adapted seeds to farmers so they can build resilience into their crops. And we're teaching them about silviculture and how they can do composting, and we're giving them climate-smart technologies on post-harvest processing and food processing. And we can just roll through the sectors. There are practical things in every sector that we know how to do that have these payoffs, and we have to design every single project so that this is built into the DNA. We cannot do a project that hasn't thought this through.
Thank you, Laura. We know it can be done. Many good examples, like Andrew, you pointed that out as well, already out there. How do we make it more systematic and scale it up in a much more, thorough way? Steele, I think Andrew made a very strong economic case why adapting now makes a lot of economic sense. And we've heard about the coalition of finance ministers that has come together recently. We've had interactions with them just a couple of weeks ago, and there is a strong discussion. Does this have a place in there? How do you see that from where you sit?
Thank you. First of all, I want to say that what you just heard, the enthusiasm is basically rubs on you. We have been discussing with Laura and really passionate about how we can help this agenda going forward. And I fully agree that it does make a lot of economic sense. The report is excellent in that way. It puts specific figures. It talks about the return on investment, and both Axel and Andrew mentioned the numbers. But I also want to draw your attention to our core mandate, which is eradicating extreme poverty. Most of sub-Saharan Africa, where a lot of the poverty is in the rural sector. and how climate impacts agriculture, very close to your heart, is even very worrisome, much more worrisome than a lot of the other issues that we are looking at. And we need to make sure that the public spending in this area is effective. We are actually coming up with a report that we jointly worked on. This will be launched next week, Harvesting Prosperity and Technology and Agricultural Productivity Growth. The key message is that we really need to rethink some of our policies and the support that we give, the resources that we dedicate to research and development, and how to make sure that the new knowledge is diffused. This is particularly critical in the context of development of technology. And it impacts on-the-ground people. I was in Kenya, and we have a program, the Kenya Livestock Insurance Program, CLIP, which is critical. It basically uses technology to look at the grazing conditions. It reduces the insurance cost drastically and allows these pastoralists to have this access to insurance, which helps them better cover some of the losses that they may survive. But what is really interesting about this program is it's not insurance in the traditional sense of come and pay for losses, but it's much more adapting to the potential losses. So can you move the herd, or can you buy feed in advance to really minimize not only economic losses, but the social losses that this brings in terms of livelihoods and so on. So I think it's really critical to engage with finance ministers, to engage with central bankers who don't necessarily think of these issues in that perspective, who don't necessarily link learnings from other elements to what they are doing. So we have been working very closely, I can go into more details later, with in the context of the coalition, but also in the network for greening the financial sector, how they can contribute to this agenda. And I must say that there's a lot of enthusiasm to really make progress.
Great. So the focus on new instruments, focus on policy changes, policy innovation that lead to these desired outcomes is very, very welcome. Minister Steele, Caribbean is at the forefront of climate change, and Grenada is one of the commissioning countries for this report. What do you hope to get out of this report, but of course, more importantly, over the next year of action?
Well, thank you, Jürgen. And it's been a real privilege to serve on the Commission and to have the opportunity to infuse into the report the perspectives, the realities of small island developing states such as Grenada, and the term that is often used, you just used Jürgen, that the Caribbean is on the front line of climate change. And there is no greater illustration of that war, that battle that we are fighting, than the plight of our brothers and sisters as we speak right now in the Bahamas.
Yeah.
When we look at the level of destruction that the Bahamas is facing, it puts into stark contrast what it is the magnitude of this challenge that we face. And there was an interesting quote from the New York Times last week that described the Bahamas as a country with a tiny carbon footprint, but carries the burden of being ground zero for global warming. And that sums up where we are. But this isn't a story unique to the Bahamas. The period of 2017, we saw the most active hurricane season within the region. Dominica, the British Virgin Islands, Barbuda, St. Martin, impacted by hurricanes Irma and Maria. 3 days ago, Grenada had its third anniversary. Its anniversary of two major hurricanes that hit us, Hurricanes Ivan and Emily, which in a matter of hours destroyed 95% buildings' property, a damage equivalent to 200% of our GDP. These are realities that we are facing on an annual basis and have become our new normal. But the threats that we face go beyond just hurricanes. The impacts of climate change are affecting our health. It's affecting our food security, water security. It's affecting our economies, our tourism. It's impacting our very, very way of life. There is nothing more fundamental that we're facing right now. So our challenge is, how do we become more resilient? How are we able to sustain less damage, less losses with these extreme events? And how are we able to recover faster when those events do occur? So what do we hope to achieve from this report? The first thing I wish to say is that this report is more than just another report. We have shelves that are full of studies on the challenges that we face. The approach that the Commission has taken, and Andrew outlined this in his presentation, is a very practical one, which resonates with the priorities that we as small island developing states have set ourselves in our battle to adapt and to become more resilient. And that is also within the context of that there is a debate out there. What's more important? Is it adaptation? Is it mitigation? Both are of considerable importance. But it's facing the reality as small island developing states that even if we achieve this collective target of limiting global warming to below 1.5 degrees centigrade, the impacts that we currently face will still remain. We have no choice, absolutely no choice, but to adapt. So our hope coming out of this report, the year of action, and all that needs to follow is the better coordination of resources, the mobilization of the necessary resources, financial, capacity building, all of the tools that we need to make the necessary interventions, and I'll speak to them later, that have been identified within this report, that genuinely bring scale and the level of urgency that's required for us to face these very, very harsh and very real realities.
Thank you, Minister. Nothing is more devastating and demoralizing than watching live on TV the utter destruction of life, property, and a whole country. And we're witnessing this more and more right in front of our eyes. And every single time, after 3 or 4 or 5 days, I'm asking myself, why does today it still happens that people after 5 days are scrambling for drinking water? Or even the most basic necessities. We as a global community are still not able to anticipate this sufficiently and prepare for it. I think actually you mentioned this focus on preparedness. It's not just about how quickly do we respond. It's how ready can we get, anticipating this can happen. And we have lead time. It's not like this happens out of nowhere. Right? So I mean, maybe that's a conversation we can pick up in the second round. Christina, you've been intimately involved in the crafting and drafting of this fabulous report. How does the adaptation intersect with equity issues from where you sit? Maybe we can discuss this a little bit. Who gets hurt more than others?
Thank you, Jürgen. I actually think, a big focus of the report and what we've talked about this afternoon is the opportunity that being prepared and adapting to climate change has in terms of reducing losses in terms of human lives, losses in terms of assets, and resilience, the importance of resilience with respect to building back and recovery. And the importance of integrating climate risks into recovery and rehabilitation and reconstruction. I think implicit and unsaid, but explicit in this report, and it's important to point out, implicit in all this is that climate change and adaptation and resilience is a justice issue. And that's where you see the intersect between adaptation and equity. impacts of climate change. So one of the biggest messages from this report is everyone is going to be impacted, no one will be spared, but there will be differences in how people, communities, countries will be able to adapt. For example, people living in poverty will have less resources, less capacity to adapt, and they're at the front lines. If you compare, for example, tropical and subtropical countries, they will be more impacted and have less capacity right now to adapt compared to countries in temperate zones. Climate change, in the example that Simon just gave, the Small Island developing states in the Caribbean, the Pacific, they are uniquely impacted by climate change. In some atoll nations, low-lying atoll nations, are facing unlivability within this century.
Yeah.
So, and in addition to that, what we haven't really picked out yet, it's implicit in what's been said, is the impact, the disproportionate impact that climate change will have on women and girls, as well as the impact that climate change will have in terms of crippling opportunities for today's youth, our children. I mean, I got a little weepy during the video of those kids. In terms of the opportunities that our children have and future generations. So equity issues are at the heart of adaptation and climate change action. And I wanted to make that explicit because that's an important point alongside the economic point. The fact that we have a commission of 34 commissioners, 20 convening countries, with representation from the highest levels of government, the private sector, to individuals who represent community-based organizations, grassroots networks, this diverse set of commissioners and convening countries, they are saying in this report that they do not accept a world where some adapt and others cannot. And that is a powerful message in addition to the economic imperative that we make. Andrew and others on this panel have highlighted the economic imperative. That said, we are not doing enough to adapt to the impacts of climate change. There are barriers. Those barriers are technical in terms of having the tools, having the understanding. We work in they're institutional. We all work in silos. Adaptation requires a cross-collaboration, cross-coordination, across ministries, vertical, horizontal. But there's also a fundamental barrier, right, to why we do not see the type of accelerated adaptation action and support today. And that is because the people who are impacted the most have very little ability to make decisions and for resources to reach them. And the fact that that is one of the fundamental barriers to accelerated action, their voices, what they're doing to adapt on their own, it's muted. And I think because of that, the urgency is muted. And so as we talk about these revolutions in understanding, in planning, and in finance, we need to remember the equity issues. Equity in terms of how we understand, who understands, whose risks are understood and whose risks are made visible, who has a voice and a seat in decision making. Does finance actually reach the local level to people who are most impacted, to women and girls? Do they have a say in how that money is used? All of that is absolutely critical. And as we go into the year of action, that will be fundamental in terms of the action tracks going forward in the year of action.
Right. So let's stay with this theme and let me push the panel a little bit on this issue. We've heard about the plans, we've discussed the strategies. So then how do we overcome these barriers that you just laid out? How do we get the money to those who really need it the most? How do we give them voice? What can we all in this panel do, and everyone in this room? Because I don't see anybody shaking their head at what you just said. Everybody realizes that that's the challenge. What can we institutionally, individually, together do to move it forward? So Laura, I'm going to put you on the spot first. What is the World Bank going to do? What are we going to do going forward to address these issues?
So let's just start with the headlines, which is money. So we need to get money out there, and the World Bank is committed, as Axel told you, to climate co-benefits in our program. But in January this year, we really stepped up and we came out with the first ever Adaptation and Resilience Action Plan, where we tried to think about this. And we committed to raising our financing for adaptation co-benefits to $50 billion between the period 2021 to 2025, which is double what we had done the previous period from FY15 to 18. And we agreed to put adaptation on par with mitigation. And this is the first MDB to do that, and it was the first time that anybody has really said, as you said, we need to think, we have to do mitigation, but we have to step up. And we had to push people to think about this because their first reaction was to think about mitigation. So that's good, so a lot of money. But then you think about, you have to mainstream it, as we were talking about before. You have to think in every project, how do you get ministers of finance, people who are making decisions about investments and spending, to think about climate? So it's not an incremental approach. It's just not an add-on to to mitigate the impacts. It's integrated into the design of everything we do. So then, okay, we can talk to ministers, they can come together, and but how do we get them to make changes in their decisions? So the team has spent a lot of time thinking about that. One idea was to come up with metrics, with a rating system that would help them be able to screen projects to think about this and to have a resilience rating system. And then we can work through the ministers, through our partnerships with others, to allow them to think it through. And we're piloting this in a number of sectors, in 8 sectors. So hydropower, water and sanitation infrastructure, agriculture and forestry, urban development, transport, power distribution, transmission, and social protection. And so the idea then is these principles are used by people in the ministries that have their hands on the money to make these decisions so that we can get to the right people, and that they take these into account as they make these decisions. I wanted to end by what you just said about next generations, because Kristalina always starts by talking about her granddaughter, and many of you know that I just had a granddaughter a couple months ago, and thank you. But what happens is, I've been talking about this for decades, right? About the importance. But when you look at this creature and you think, you put these numbers up here by 2030, by 2050, these are so far in the future, thinking, oh my God, in 2030, she's only going to be 20 years old. They're going to be living, and the world we are leaving for these people, our young people, is going to be uninhabitable. There's no way we're staying. We are at 1 degree right now. The NDCs, the people that countries have committed to, get us to 3.5, and we're not on track to meet those. So this world that our grandchildren are going to live in is going to be very different, and they need to learn. We need to build a planet where they can survive, and we protect the resources that we have. And that has to be every single one of us in every single project needs to think about this.
Thank you, Laura. A lot of practical suggestions. We need to understand all the pieces of the puzzle. Actually, we were talking about this yesterday. If you don't have all the pieces, finance ministers aren't going to respond. This has to fit within the broader context of what a finance minister or what a country strategy and program does. So, Steele, what are the other conversations that you are having in that context? And how could this sort of begin to evolve into a comprehensive approach that will turn the strategy, the plan, the talk into really solid hardwired action courses?
So I think the key is first having the analytical work and the planning to understand what it means, because you mentioned there are sometimes it costs 40% of GDP, 160% of GDP, and all the budget gets turned upside down. Debt sustainability gets turned upside down. So a lot of these issues we don't yet incorporate into our macroeconomic thinking and modeling, both in terms of growth, but also in terms of debt and fiscal planning. So I think there's a key role to understand how we can measure some of the implications, how we can incorporate it in our decision making in terms of the medium-term revenue strategy or any fiscal 3 to 5 year fiscal planning that ministers of finance do. Macroeconomic stress testing, to really look at what are contingency plans, what are some counter-cyclical arrangements that can be put into place. So we have been working with many governments to think about how to incorporate climate change considerations into their policy making, into their decision making. And that goes from the design of public investment projects to avoiding pro-cyclical fiscal policies, to contingency funds, fiscal buffers, and also identifying exploring ways that risks can be transferred to the markets and pool risks across countries at reasonable cost. So a lot of this are work in train, and I think what we need to do is work with each of the countries and in regional arrangements to make much more progress. One issue that we don't pay as much attention to, and really partnering with the IFC on this, is that what is the enabling environment to bring in the private sector? Because there's a lot of money in the private sector, so both in terms of investments, quote-unquote impact investments, but also what makes business sense for them. How can we make sure that that this efforts in terms of research and in terms of looking at market failures that are really preventing for these technologies and the private sector to come in. We talked about we talked about a lot of the efforts that we are putting in place, the coalition, the network for greening the financial sector, which is the group of central banks, which 3-4 years ago, I sit at the Financial Stability Board, the word climate comes up and everyone moves their chair because it's just such a foreign concept to them when central banks are mainly looking at macro-financial risks. But this is now the key discussion that is at the table because they all understand that there are implications, there are stranded assets which will affect the financial sector, there are implications in terms of policy choices that will have implications for the financial sector again. So really working with the ministers of finance, central banks and supervisors to understand these implications and planning for them will be critical going forward. And it will require macro, micro, sectoral experts, climate experts to really work together, because I think we all need this coordinated approach to be able to have some actionable policies.
Thank you, Seda. A real sense of progress there, but also a clear wake-up call that we still have a long way to go until this gets into the boardrooms, until this gets into the central banks, until this gets into the mainstream thinking about how to plan and execute economic growth in an economy. Minister Steele, what comes next from your perspective? You are part of the commissioning body, and I'm sure you're pushing hard. What are you pushing hard?
Well, what comes next is very, very simple. One word is action. It's converting these great ideas, these great recommendations, priorities that have been identified into real, meaningful, concrete action, and developing adaptation plans that are responsive, genuinely responsive to small island developing states and other developing countries, and we're a long way away from where we need to be. And I was pleased that, Laura, the very first point that you raised, it's about resource mobilization. It is about money. It is about scaling up those resources that are available to us, together with the necessary capacity building. Financial resources alone will not cut it. The need to build that absorptive capacity for us to take the necessary action is a critical part of that. It also, certainly for developing nations, small island developing states, it goes beyond the engagement of our ministers of finance. I can speak for my own, I can speak for others within the region. Ministers of finance are abundantly aware of what is required. The challenge that we face is insufficient fiscal space to do the things that we need to do. Notwithstanding the fact that we are doing all of the things within our capacity, or moving towards doing all that we can to create that necessary space, we can double it, triple it, quadruple it. The scale of the challenges that we face and the resources that are required for us to do the things that we need to do is just so massive. So we need to go beyond that. And the call from small island developing states is the need for those special considerations, the need for greater, the scaling up of those resources and ease of access to those resources. And the launch of this report comes at a very important time. The Green Climate Fund, the largest climate financing institution that we have access to, is going through its replenishment process. And the need for donors to support this replenishment process, again at the scale that is necessary, comes at a very, very critical time. What is very interesting within this report, and something that absolutely needs to be developed, is the business case for adaptation. So our immediate call will be for concessional grant resources that we need to supplement our own. But developing that business case that will attract private sector investment, other areas of investment, is critical. And whether that multiplier effect is 2 to 1, 10 to 1, that really needs to be drawn out so that we can enrich the blend of financing mechanisms that are necessary for us to achieve what we need to achieve. And again, Selah and Laura both mentioned it, the need for us all to play our part. This isn't about a single institution. It is not about a single sector doing what it has to do. It's about all of us. And speaking on behalf of Grenada, who's taken some very bold steps, some very difficult steps to get our house in order, to do those things that are within our control to do, we recognize we cannot do this alone. And it's only with the cooperation of the donor community, our development partners, the private sector, others, to make this happen, are we going to even stand a chance of doing the things that we need to do.
A call for a conversation on, do we have the right global financial architecture to deal with this? Do we have sufficient commitment on those who can provide the funding? Do we have the right instruments? And this is a conversation that's ongoing since a very long time, been involved in many SITS conversations. Even the Green Climate Fund, at the maximum of $10 billion over 4 years, you're looking at $2 to $3 billion per year, where the needs are $2 to $3 trillion per year. So that is not the answer alone. It is a very important one, but not the answer in itself. So that will continue, and certainly we at the bank will have be part of that conversation. Christina, we only have a few minutes left. A quick word on the analytical part. Going forward, after this analytical piece, what are the 2 or 3 things you're thinking about doing next, potentially?
Thank you, Jürgen. In terms of the what comes next, I think this report is not like the Christopher Columbus of reports, right? We aren't charting new territory in terms of identifying the importance of adaptation or saying, you know, what the solutions are. There are a lot of good, solid reports and analytics out there. What we are doing with this commission, with this report, is shining a really huge light that, one, this is a challenge that we must address now, and we have the capacity to do it. And in mobilizing the broader community, both the climate community and the broader community in development, in the finance community, it is about mobilizing those communities vis-a-vis this report to set out this year of action. Mm-hmm. So what we've done alongside the analytics over the last 8 months is to mobilize political support for accelerated action and support for adaptation. So in part 3 of the report does lay out these 8 action tracks. It lays out what we're going to do as a commission to jumpstart the transitions and the recommendations that the report points out. We've already started to build that political commitment, just using the food security action track as an example. There are already 21 partners that we've mobilized, and we'll build more in order to achieve that overarching goal in that action track to help 300 million smallholder farmers become more resilient. So really, someone said to me, a few people at WRI this morning said, congratulations, you must be so relieved it's done, you must be getting rest now. And really, there is no rest. This is when it starts.
Thank you. We have a hard stop at 2:30, but I would invite 1 or 2 questions if they are brief and not statements. If you have anything that we haven't covered yet, please feel free. Yes, please. Go to the microphone if you don't mind.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. I have a question to the Commission, so to Christina. I think Laura and Salem mentioned how the World Bank is stepping up its game. The action plan made very specific recommendations on how we will specifically support finance ministers, how we'll support the private sector in making the business case that the minister called for. So my question for the Commission is specifically looking at support going to the non-traditional adaptation sectors, which the report did a great job highlighting, but to ministries of finance, to the private sector. Concretely, what will the year of action deliver? Can we expect more upstream support going to those stakeholder groups? Thank you.
Yes, who would like to take this one?
Happy to do that. Thank you, Aram. And I want to thank Aram as well for all of the contributions that she has made to the report as well. The question is a really good one. Support for integrating climate risk and adaptation into financial planning, into budgeting is one of the core pieces of work in the year of action. And we intend to work with the Coalition of Finance Ministers, with the V20, to help make sure that the capacity, the assistance that is needed to really integrate climate risk considerations and adaptation into fiscal, financial planning and budgeting is core and part and parcel of day-to-day business, and that is one of the key initiatives coming into the year of action. Thanks, Aram.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to leave you with this thought. When you leave this room, I think what you've heard hopefully has deeply and profoundly impacted you. This is not just another report. This is a call for all of us to change the way we look at decision making in every sector that we work in, every policy that we look at, in every project that we are involved in. To not see adaptation as an add-on. This is about saving lives of people. This is about getting ahead of the game that we watch on TV every week of the year now. We have to take this seriously and we have to hardwire it into everything we do. So if that was achieved, then I would like to thank our speakers and our panelists for their contributions, and also all of those who have worked on this report. And certainly good luck to those who work on the next year, including ourselves, to turn what we've heard into serious action. Thank you, everybody.